renewables have a different economic construct. And if you think of solar panels, for example, once you've deployed that asset and you've paid for it, it's zero marginal operating cost. So it doesn't actually cost you any more to have it on from that point. So you basically never turn it off. We work extensively with our clients and the system operators and that to understand what's possible, how to manage that new complexity, if you will, that's also reducing the cost of energy overall to consumers.
This is Energy Cast, and I'm Jay Downhauer. Today we're talking about optimizing assets for an electric grid that's becoming more and more complex. As my guest explains, you've got more distributed resources generating energy, like solar, but you also have more energy loads, like AI, data centers, and electric vehicles. It's hard to make sense of it all, especially since all these variables are becoming a larger portion of the overall mix. How do you plan for something like this? Also, how do you anticipate changes in public policy like placing a price on carbon or eliminating a nationwide mandate for electric vehicles? My guest helps clients make sense of all this. Their software helps simulate these future scenarios, not just for the long term, but day to day. He says clients may run millions of hours of models per month. Everything from what days are windy to the loss of a transmission line. It's a fascinating conversation. I've worked for several utilities over the years, and what I can tell you is they hate uncertainty. They've relied on proven technologies, and I've seen firsthand how something as trivial as the material used for insulators on a power line can lead to multi-million-dollar retrofits back to the older technologies. Needless to say, we're living in one of the most transformative decades in the 140-year history of electrification. It's up to folks like today's guest to ensure these demand dynamics all come into play. My guest today is David Wilson, CEO of Energy Exemplar, a software developer specializing in resource planning for utilities. The company's roots go back to 1999. Today, Energy Exemplar has clients in over 80 countries, ranging from utilities like National Grid and Duke Energy to grid operators to energy traders. I wanted the conversation to serve as a sort of place setter. Where do we currently stand in the energy landscape? Are we facing real challenges like energy shortages from renewables and excess demand from data centers? Also, are we producing too much renewable energy at times of the day when the demand is not as high? On the latter question, something I've brought up several times on the podcast, David presented a point that I never really considered, but makes all the sense in the world. Be sure to listen for it. I hope you enjoy my conversation with David Wilson. We're here with David Wilson, CEO of Energy Exemplar. And David, your company focuses on software that helps utilities and resource planners make the most of their assets. What are some of the biggest challenges you're hearing from them today?
So Energy Exemplar builds tools that enable people to look into the future. We build physics to economic simulators because the energy system in its essence is a large supply chain. You've got sources of generation, you've got transmission and distribution, and then you've got demand. And that's a supply chain. And we help solve that problem. So we enable people to look out seconds, years, decades into the future and understand what's the right things to build, sell, retire, and how to operate them in the near term. And so what we're seeing in the grids today is a lot of change. In fact, it's an unprecedented level of change. And so a couple of different themes driving that. The first is the rise of renewables as an incredible change to the energy landscape, driven primarily by the incredible cost reductions in solar and wind over the last few years, which has really made them the cheapest form of new build power. And the challenge that comes with those is the variability of them. So they generate when the wind blows and the sun shines. And so managing the grid in that more complex environment is change. Fortunately, storage has also come onto the scene with relatively low cost, primarily lithium-ion batteries. And that's really changed the supply side. And then on the demand side, really the rise of new load. And so that's driven in part by the rise of data centers. And you've seen some pretty amazing announcements this week around a Stargate proposal. But even without that proposal, there's a lot happening in that sector and really the electrification of industrial loads. So that's really driven in a lot of ways by decarbonisation decarbonisation efforts, but also just electrification is a big theme. So you've seen it in transportation, industry, and many other parts of life. And so with all of that, we're seeing those changes to the market, and some of the assets are getting quite constrained now. So a lot of demand for new energy, and finding ways to fit all of that into the grid is proving quite a hot topic right at the minute.
Right. Your technology is software. Are you using AI for some of these predictions and some of these recommendations?
Yeah, primary way we do it is we build a physical model of the network. It's more a fundamental forecast. We model every asset in the grid and the physics of that. And then from that, we can turn it into an economic model. It's a bit of an analogy that if you think of a car, if you know the time from you turn the key to it, it starts, how fast it can accelerate from 0 to 50, 50 to 100, how much fuel it uses those speeds. They're kind of physics associated with the car. If you know how much the fuel costs and you know what a maintenance costs, now you've got an economic model. And we do that across the whole energy network. What this looks like in an energy context is you have sources of generation, you've got those transmission lines, you've got the demand centers. And when you look at, say, somewhere like the Eastern Interconnect in the US, which is the largest grid in the world, stretching the whole way from the Canadian border down into Florida, we'll model over 250,000 objects and their interconnections. And we can run the models of that to understand how they'll operate. Once we've done that, we can then train AIs and other machine learning models as well to help speed up getting answers out of those. And because of the different weather scenarios you need to model, people will model up to thousands of different scenarios of, is it windy over here, sunny over there, or does a power line go out of service? The models get very large. In fact, our clients run millions of hours of these different models every month to understand what the grid will look like.
Sure. Going into the AI thing, you mentioned that data centers was a big factor in the future of energy moving forward, and a big part of your business. I recently spoke with NVIDIA, and the energy issue was the first thing we tackled, actually the energy used to run these centers, right? And one of the points my guest made, and this goes into how you're able to do forecasts, was some of the most pessimistic estimates regarding the grid's ability to bear the load of all the AI and new data centers was they weren't taking into account the efficiency gains a company like NVIDIA can achieve. For instance, for AI operations, one generation to the next, they were able to reduce the amount of power consumed by 25-fold, not even 25%. So do you agree with that? Do you think that there'll be major efficiencies there that'll affect the demand?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and there's no doubt there's been great strides made in the efficiencies of the underlying AI models. But what we're seeing today is just the sheer scale of the data center build out is overwhelming. And having been around a while, I've been through a few tech hype cycles, but this one feels pretty real. There's a lot of projects in planning at the minute, and that's been quite sudden, actually. If you look back 3 or 4 years ago, there was relatively modest demand from data centers. With the generative AI boom really over the last 18 months, that's materially expanded the amount of projects that are trying to come to market. So I'm sure some of it's hype, but overall the demand from data centers is materially increasing. This current forecast from COT and others is that it may make up 8% of the grid demand by 2030. I think that number is a little bit rubbery, but will certainly be a material part of it moving forward.
I would also think public policy might factor into that. And one of the executive orders that President Trump did was a ban on the mandates for electric vehicles. And, you know, a mandate for electric vehicles versus the market deciding how many electric vehicles they really want, that had to play a little bit into your predictions, did it not?
Well, a little bit. Surprisingly, transportation's not a huge part of the forecast load. It does add up, but it's nowhere near as big as the industrial loads and the data center loads. What I do think will happen is electric vehicles maturing quite quickly. 10 years ago, they hardly existed and they've made big strides. So I do anticipate that they will continue to be a significant factor moving forward as their cost comes down. They're very cheap to run. I think the economics will play into their favor. So yes, some of the mandates may go away, but I think the economics will still make them compelling for quite a few consumers.
Right. And I think also on EVs, the charging is the biggest question when it comes to the grid, right? Where do you put the chargers? Does that overload the grid? Can you do more of a demand response, right? And control when they charge? How is that factored into the work you've been doing?
The nice thing about EVs and some of the media coverage coverage tends to focus on the most problematic use cases of them, which is getting in it and doing a long road trip on a holiday weekend and the challenges with charging and all of that. For most EVs, they're actually charged at home, and you sort of start the morning with that full tank of gas equivalent, if you will. What we've been seeing is that ability to flex demand around those or manage it, what we would call an orchestration problem, like when do you encourage or charge those vehicles, when don't you, is maturing. It's different in different markets, and some of the more loaded markets or those with a higher use of their capacity, such as California, there's scenarios in Australia and some of the European markets where they manage this through incentives and even handing over control of the charging overnight to a third party. That's working quite well because there can be incentives around that, given to the point of basically getting free energy at certain hours of the day to charge those vehicles. That seems to be working quite well. Then the build out of the fast charging pieces is a little more complex, but I've certainly been noticing from a personal experience that seems to have accelerated over the last 18 months. And in my neighborhood, they've been popping up quite regularly. So I don't think it's really a major challenge for the grid. And a lot of the planning is more at a local level about where do you put them and how do you manage the traffic and all of those kind of pieces.
I want to talk a little bit about the distribution side voltages, the voltages going to your homes. David, I dealt with this firsthand. We had a battery project that was actually on a distribution circuit, in a circuit that fed a neighborhood. And what was pretty apparent when we spoke to the distribution planners was you have the conventional loads, what is needed to run the homes. You have rooftop solar feeding back to the grid. That's new. And then you have energy storage, depending on the time of day and the weather, may either be charging or discharging. And there are times of the day where the charging and the load from the customers could be too much on that circuit, or the solar and discharging from a battery could be too much on a circuit. Are you seeing some of that, just these congestion bottlenecks?
Yeah, it tends to be in markets. And one of the nice things about my role is we get to see what's happening around the globe because we're serving 80 countries at the minute. And it's really only in those markets that are, I guess, on the cutting edge of renewable adoption. And some of those are seeing very high renewable penetration. I'll pick South Australia, where we have an office, and there it's got the highest rooftop domestic solar penetration in the world, where every second house has solar. And at multiple times of the year, the entire state is powered just by rooftop solar and no grid assets running, which is quite remarkable to have seen that transition from a few percent a decade ago to over 100% now. And so that creates a situation where the grid operator needs to curtail some of the assets or manage them. That's been an evolution here, that orchestration software, if you will, and the communication to the various inverters around the community to be able to say, hey, we're going to curtail you, which means basically we're not letting you put energy into the grid for the next period while we're at this peak. That's technically very possible and working well today. Part of the conundrum with that comes is, as you curtail different assets in the community, who pays for that? Do the people who've had their solar panels turned off lose the revenue, or does the community as a whole subsidize that? And that's one of the active debates in both the California market at the minute and some of these other highly penetrated renewable markets.
That's a great point, that not only could rooftop solar be curtailed, the idea that if you curtail the rooftop power, some families are missing out on the revenue generation, which was kind of part of the business proposition of getting rooftop solar in the first place, right?
That's right. And so this really comes into the tariff design, and it's an active debate at the minute, how to solve that. Some of these are literally still in the design phase right now, but a lot of the thinking is if you're being curtailed, you still get paid the average price that you would have got, and to not disincentivize people to put those assets on their houses.
Well, that's very generous of whoever's paying for the energy that's not being curtailed.
It is, but you're kind of dropping the average, right? So rather than pay, let's say there's 100 houses and 10 curtailed, rather than pay those 90 houses and not the 10, you take the same average of what the 100 should have got and spread it across. So it ends up being the same economics. There's no more being given. It's just being distributed. You're giving less to more people.
Yeah, they're still making less than if all the solar was being purchased at the same price, which kind of leads me to where Energy Exemplar probably comes in. Is this the point where you are able to make recommendations on saying adding storage, adding other resources to prevent that?
Yeah, so you've got a couple of different options. You can do these orchestration things, if you will. So try and encourage more load at those times of peak generation. You'll see more EV charging and battery charging happening during the sunny hours of the day. And that's kind of the easiest thing, to use what you already have. And then you can move to building new assets as well. So maybe more storage or other things. And then one of the things with renewables, it's kind of okay to waste some as well, because sometimes it's cheaper to have more and let some of that production spill. An analogy would be, if you're in a wet area, you'll have dams to supply your water for your house. And it's okay during a really wet event to let the dam spill over a little bit. You don't have to catch every drop of water, as long as you've got enough to get you through. And it's very similar with some of these renewables, particularly as solar, and that is getting very, very cheap. It's okay to overbuild and let some of that spill or waste, if you will.
Going into storage, I had a very interesting panel that I got to host with 3 of the grid operators from ERCOT, which is Texas, CalISO, California, and New York ISO. These were the market designers for energy storage. And it certainly seemed like more needs to be done in terms of resource adequacy for energy storage. The name of the game is reliability. Do you have it when we need it, right? As well as other proper market drivers. What's been your experience with energy storage and being able to help these folks make the business case for it?
Yes, this varies a little bit by geography, because what storage enables is more than storage of electrons, if you will. The modern battery storages have very powerful inverters that can serve other functions as well, and what we typically call ancillary services. So that's the ability to raise the voltage of the grid or provide frequency support, so stabilizing the grid in other ways as well. This is where market design becomes very critical, because yes, they can make money storing energy to bring back into the grid later, but they can also make money providing these other services. And so in a lot of markets, you can do what's called revenue stacking. You get some money for that trading element of the energy, but you also get the money for these ancillary services, which makes batteries quite compelling. And if you look at the statistics, that the deployment of batteries is ramping up very quickly, partly driven by the material cost reductions in the technology, which has been falling very fast, but also by the ability to support the increasing amounts of renewables into the grid.
Do you think there are proper, market conditions to incentivize what we really need? I think that one of the things that folks in Texas were saying was they all had this short duration storage, like 2 hours. They really need for like 4 or 5, right?
Yes, and this is where each region in the US faces some different market rules. ERCOT or Texas has its own specific rules there, and it doesn't incentivize, not currently, the long-term duration and some of these other ancillary services. I know it's an active review with those organizations to say, given the fast evolving landscape and what's happening in energy, we need to actually review our market rules and incentives to make sure that we're getting the right mix of everything and getting the best of all the technologies have to offer these days. One of the things that happens is those regulations have historically changed relatively slowly and perhaps a little left behind by the technology innovations today. I know it's a big focus of them to modernize those.
Changing gears a little bit and talking about the mix involved, I was interested to see that you're working with companies to find the best way to add hydrogen. Is hydrogen viable now? I know that some of the costs are high for some applications. What are some of the examples that you've seen adding hydrogen in the mix now?
We're seeing a lot of activity on the, I'll call it the early development front, where people are looking at using large-scale solar to make hydrogen and then even potentially turn that into derivative products, because once you've got hydrogen and more energy, you can actually make any hydrocarbon you want. And so a lot of work being done on the early phase of making green ammonia, so you can use hydrogen to make ammonia. And the reason why they're looking at that is it's easy to transport. You can use traditional shipping and tankers and that to move it around. So a lot of early stage work on that. In Europe, they have been building a hydrogen backbone. So this is a pipe network across Europe to enable hydrogen. And they have incentive structures and regulation in place to really drive towards net zero. The question around, is it economic? Well, that depends, right? And so economics is a human construct. We sort of decide what's in it or not. And so in Europe, they've decided that some of the costs of pollution are in there and the incentives are in their economic model. So that makes hydrogen work. In most of the other parts of the world at the minute, pollution's free. So So the green benefit or the clean benefit of hydrogen really doesn't necessarily get it over the line when it competes with traditional fossil fuels. To distill that down, if you will, for hydrogen to really work, then you need the right incentive market. Now, there's several players investing substantially into that, and it's a bit of an open question on when it will stand on its own without subsidies, but it's not there today.
Everyone wants to talk about renewable energy, obviously, but there's still a huge amount of baseload, fossil and nuclear out there. It's real simple. You just assume that power is always on. But are there ways that Energy Exemplar has been able to run them, say, differently, more efficiently than they've been run before?
What we've seen is that assumption doesn't hold true when you get to high or reasonably high penetration of renewables. And the reason for that is renewables have a different economic construct. And if you think of solar panels, for example, it's all capital costs. So once you've deployed that asset and you've paid for it, it's zero marginal operating cost. So it doesn't actually cost you any more to have it on from that point. So you basically never turn it off. And what you see, this concept of the duck curve, where you get a lot of generation in the middle of the day from solar, and it's pushing the prices close to zero, which overall is a good thing, or pushing them right down. That's changing the nature of what happens with the concept of baseload and whether you even need it, right? Because during the day, you're getting all this very cheap generation from solar. And so we're seeing the behavior of traditional fossil plants and nuclear plants to an extent, lesser extent, change, where they actually ramp down during the middle of the day, or almost to off, and then ramp up in the evening peaks and overnight again. So we work extensively with our clients and the system operators and that to understand what's possible, how to manage that new complexity, if you will, that's also reducing the cost of energy overall to consumers. So it's a little bit more complicated to run the grid than it was, but the benefits of it are it's cleaner and cheaper than before.
A good point. And then finally, what's on the minds of your customers more than anything, and what has you the most excited?
One of the hottest topics at the minute is where to find sites to put in large data centers and other industrial demands. So people are spending a lot of time looking at the grid and working out where they can fit new assets in. You mentioned resource adequacy. There's a lot of work going on about how do we bring more renewables into the grid and more solar panels on people's houses, etc., but keep the grid stable and the lights on. So a huge amount of work happening with that. And then a lot of modeling around the world on how do you get to net zero emissions on different timeframes. Many countries have made commitments that they're going to be net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, whatever it may be. How do you build the pathway to that makes that as economic as possible?
All right, David, I want to finish with a lightning round of your thoughts on different energy technologies, starting with natural gas.
Yeah, well, certainly this week's announcement means a bigger role for natural gas in North America.
Crude oil.
The world's awash with crude at the minute, so I think it will continue to see a decline and low prices.
Nuclear.
Legacy assets are being repowered because they're cheap. Well, ones that were turned off because they were uneconomic, but there's no really new ones being commissioned.
Coal, and I'll add coal with carbon capture.
I spent 2 years of my life working on coal with carbon capture, and I think it's a dead end.
Wind.
Lowest cost of energy on land at the minute, with a slow rollout of offshore happening around the world.
Solar.
It's a juggernaut that just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Biofuels.
Slowly.
Hydroelectric.
Most of the good resources have already been developed.
Geothermal.
Interesting. Still trying to crack the cost problem here.
Energy storage.
Lithium-ion batteries are winning the race.
Energy efficiency.
The easiest way to create new power is not use some of it.
And then finally, fusion power.
Amazing advances, but it still feels quite a few years away.
All right, David Wilson, Energy Exemplar, thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate it. It's been fantastic to have a conversation.
That was David Wilson, CEO of Energy Exemplar, a resource planning software company based in Salt Lake City. I want to thank David for his time, as well as Cliff Maroney at Aspectus Group for setting this up. You can find plenty of pictures for this episode on energy-cast.com, as well as on Instagram at HostEnergy and X at HostEnergyCast. All guests are sent the raw and completed audio the week of release. So far, no complaints. Be sure to leave us a positive review on iTunes. That gets the word out. Music was produced by Sean Stroop at Stroop Loops. That wraps up episode 184. Be sure to join us next week when we learn how the world's largest supplier of transformers is keeping their supply chain moving across an evolving global landscape. Until then, I'm Jay Dowenhauer. We'll see you next time.